All right. Welcome again, and thank you all for joining again. So the purpose of this meeting is to continue the discussion on that we started yesterday on PVC DataSource. To set some background again, the volume snapshot and volume clone features are currently moving to beta. And inside the PVC object, we have an inline data source which allows you to specify either snapshot or volume, PVC volume for cloning as a source. And we plan to expand that in the future to allow any general type of data source, any type of CRD, basically. The proposal was to basically decouple the data source into a standalone object. So instead of all the data source information being inline, it's in a separate object that then itself points to another object. And the primary benefits of this proposal are around flexibility in being able to define the data source independent of the minimum storage requirements. So from kind of a logical perspective, a PVC is part of the application definition in defining the storage requirements for a given application. And by putting the data source into a separate object, it allows us to decouple those two pieces of work, or decouple those two things into separate kind of objects, and you can make decisions on them independently. I think it helps the GitOps workflow by allowing us to have the PVC and the pod objects, basically the things that define an application, checked in to your source control. And when you deploy it onto a cluster, you don't have to modify it at all, which is kind of the thinking behind the GitOps principles or GitOps way of doing things. The counter argument to that is, well, something needs to create your volume data source. And what is that something, and how does that get checked in? And I think my argument to that is, well, you can have something like a controller that'll automatically create the volume data source, but then the question is, well, how does that controller know how to create the volume data source? It needs some input. It needs something to tell it what to do, and though that something is likely going to be a CRD. And those CRDs need to be checked in. And I think that is okay, because that CRD could be something like a policy or something generic to say, hey, please, inject the current latest snapshot. The counter argument that I've heard to this is, well, you could have the PVC data source just be a template when you check into Git. Instead of specifying a specific data source, check in a template, and then before deployment, inject in whatever actual data source that you want. The problem with that approach is that it requires you at deployment time to have enough information to make that call. And versus if you have something like a standalone volume data source, you could have a controller that has all the rich functionality of what Kubernetes components are capable of doing to make a decision at runtime about what that data source should be. It could query, a backend to figure out what are the volume snapshots that are available in that cluster. What is the topology of that cluster? Rich information from inside that cluster to make that call. Versus if you were forced to do it at deployment time, you kind of have to at deployment time, you have to somehow be able to have enough information to make that call, either like call out to the back end. And I don't think you'll have enough information at that point, honestly. The counter arguments for data source, other counter arguments are timeline for clone and snapshot. Snapshot has already been out for a long time. And they're trying to move to beta this quarter. If we go down the path of potentially saying, hey, we want to do a whole new standalone object, we could delay the timeline for both clone and snapshot by another probably 2 quarters, which would be pretty bad. And so that's where we left off on the discussion yesterday. So I'll open it up. Anybody want to get started?
Can I ask, has there been any thought into specifically what a policy might look like? I ask because here it seems fairly abstract, but it also seems super crucial to how all of this would work. Like if we're saying that the data source is created from some policy, but we're not discussing the policy, I think that's kind of leaving out a huge part of the picture.
Yeah, I think we can start talking through it. Kind of straw man, rough design. I was thinking some controller which spits out data, volume data source objects. It has some input, a policy that it accepts to say, you know, this is how I will select which data source, which volume data source to pick. Details of that I honestly haven't thought through, but we can talk through it in this meeting.
And in your example of, I'd like to be able to check everything into Git with the data source as a separate object, then even on your first deployment, you would need to construct data sources with like an empty data source for every one of your volumes, wouldn't you? Like so, in the default case, and you're not restoring from something.
Yeah, so in the default case, if you don't have a policy, you don't have a standalone controller, yes, you would have to create a empty volume data source
for every
PVC object and a pod object. And so
that doesn't seem like a crazy thing to do. I mean, I'm not familiar with this GitOps workflow, but would that be a reasonable requirement to add on and say, okay, look, don't check your data sources in. We're just going to create PVCs that point to data sources that don't exist, and then you got to go figure out what to put there. And that wouldn't annoy anybody, or would people just start checking in the data sources too, and then you're back to the original problem of now.
I think having a separate standalone object helps somewhat in that you don't have to go and muck with the core types that define what the application is. I
absolutely think that more indirection is usually better. I just want to think through.
Yeah.
Is it actually better here?
Right.
And I'm confused that we would want to impart upon users even just creating these null objects to support a workflow that's outside how we normally do storage. I mean, if not everyone is going to support the GitOps workflow, right? If we're talking about multi-cluster, not that I don't think it's a bad idea, but I feel like we're positioning ourselves to do something outside that other people might be interested in doing, but we're putting a requirement on storage then to support that, which is not how Kubernetes necessarily requires things to be done. So it's a workflow that I don't feel like we should be doing through storage, is my opinion.
If you leave data source off though, then you get the current default behavior of an empty PVC, right?
If you leave volume data source off, you get the current default behavior, yes.
So it's not required, it's optional?
No, yes.
Okay, I missed that part.
But for someone to take advantage of this new functionality, you would want to specify a data source and then.
Right. And so the purpose is like if you specify a data source object, Kubernetes knows to wait for the existence of that data source object before it does something. It's kind of the standard Kubernetes model of like I can apply a bunch of YAML files all in parallel without worrying what order I apply them in, and Kubernetes does the right thing. And so if I have a reference to a data source object.
I sent out a little document last night. I don't know if anybody looked at it, but.
I don't think I got it, John.
Hello?
Hello? I don't think I got it.
Yeah,
John,
I got it. I saw your.
Yeah, I just, I pulled it up here.
So I'm having difficulty. What's different about your proposal from the direction we were on? So if you look, for example, I'll post in the chat a link because there's an awful lot of words there. But if you look, the direction we were heading was the CRD would define a kind, and it would do exactly what you're describing. So for example, in the GitHub workflow, you could have the controller just do a wait loop back, or a wait with a back off until the kind and the actual object for the data source independently.
Yeah, and the big difference is that yes, we always plan to open up the types that we're going to allow for data source to be any arbitrary CRD. What we're saying now is that there is a special type. Data source is a special type that all the Kubernetes controllers, all the CSI controllers know how to handle specially. And the benefit of that extra level of indirection is that we can differentiate between I have a PVC where I don't care about the data source, meaning I did not specify a data source at all, versus I have a PVC with a data source that is empty, versus I have a PVC with a data source that points to something legitimate. And so it introduces an extra kind of option, an extra state that the rest of the Kubernetes system can pivot on.
So two things about that. So I don't agree that you can't do that with the other option. But the problem with tying it into something that Kubernetes understands is we run into the same problem that in my opinion, we have today, where we limit the ability for people to actually develop any of their own custom CRDs. So they can't do this extension on their own.
Oh, no, they definitely can. So everything that we're talking about here with populators and snapshots and all of this, it would still continue to exist. It would just be defined in a separate data source object. So if you look at what we have for data source currently, it's name, kind, and API group, where kind and API group are going to point to some CRD. The plan is to move those into the new volume data source object. So you still have the ability to do exactly the same thing. You just have an intermediate object in the middle. So the intention is still to allow for generic volume data sources, as well as snapshots, as well as clones, but to introduce an extra kind of layer in the middle.
So to support other flows outside of persistent volume claims, because I'm trying to understand the motivation. Like,
sorry, say that again, Aaron.
Are you trying to just have it not be tied directly to the persistent volume claim, and that's
exactly
driving it?
Yeah, because I think in my head, a persistent volume claim is kind of defining here are my kind of minimum storage requirements, and then jamming in there, here is what I want the data to look like, starts getting very messy. And if we extrapolate that out, it's going to probably put us in a place that we're going to end up regretting. And so if we decouple that, put it into a separate object, it gives us more flexibility, create these objects dynamically, and in general, flexibility and extensibility tend to have treated us well in the past.
So I want to step back a little bit. So the use case for this is not really well understood, and there's a lot of contention on whether the Git use case is sufficient. Like other people made the arguments, you can just not check in the PVC or not check in the data source. And to kind of delay, well-known use cases like clone and snapshot for something that's not yet well understood seems unnecessary. That, and it doesn't prevent you to add this later in the future. So you can just have a new kind. So if you go back to the old way where the PVC had the kind and the name, you can have a kind of data source later. Like you can add the same concept and it would still work for those people who have that use case.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that was one of the proposals we had yesterday, which was we can kind of have our cake and eat it too by letting volume snapshot and volume cloning continue on the current path, then introduce a new data source object as a standalone thing. The drawback of that approach is that the snapshots and cloning will have two ways of doing of being able to be specified. You could either specify them directly in line or in a separate object. And that may be confusing to users, but the benefit of this approach is that it would allow us to decouple the timelines and continue, not block snapshot or volume cloning. I'm open to that option. What do folks think?
I think, well, one thing we should consider is I feel like with the existing design that we have, like the restore flow for something like a stateful set is still really difficult.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. I think we haven't fleshed out a lot of stuff related to stateful sets and how data source would look in that scenario. Like, are we going to start creating data sources? Like is like stateful set, like the first, like, you know how it's named 0, 1, 2, like, are we going to have to start having data sources 0, 1, 2? So I think like,
What I actually mean though is like today, with like not even considering this, restoring a stateful set is hard with the inline data source, because in your application you're not actually going to define individual PVCs. You just define the stateful set, and the stateful set is the one that creates the PVCs. So like if every single volume wants to be restored from a different snapshot, I think that's not really possible today.
but how would this proposal help there? And I don't disagree with you. I just think we need probably more time to flesh out a lot of that stuff. And I
think the benefit in that case would be that the responsibility of the stateful set controller just becomes very simple. The stateful set controller does what it does for PVCs, which is create a templatized name and stick like a 1, 2, 3 suffix on it. And then it's the responsibility of some other controller to then come in and make sure that those objects exist. Right now you've decoupled the responsibility. Instead of requiring the PVC or the stateful set controller or whatever creates the PVC to understand every type of data source and be able to give you the rich information for that data source, they can then basically outsource the responsibility of specifying the details of the data source to some other controller.
I don't see that to differ that much though. If you have the current design, you basically just need to specify the kind, right? That's the extra thing that you want to remove. Then you could still use the template for the names, even with the current design, right? So the only thing is you want to get rid of the kind and API group. You only leave the name there.
I think the problem with the current design is that for stateful set, you have to like, for example, you have to figure out the name of each volume snapshot, which rather than generating a determined name, you have to figure out like, you know, what are the names of these volume snapshots.
But the new suggestion, you would also have to figure that out, right? You don't.
Yeah, but actually, so I think the proposal Saad was mentioning was having the stateful set controller create these data sources objects and give them deterministic names.
Whoa, hold on.
But why? But then why isn't that? Why can't you do that with the existing design? I
right.
don't think I get it.
Yeah.
I don't see how this is much better.
So we can just say that by default, a stateful set will treat the name as a templated name, and then it would still work based on the kind.
But you can do that either way.
So it's, I think it's doable.
Exactly.
Why?
Yeah, I don't think actually, we're talking through this, I think you're right. It doesn't help the stateful set case as much as I thought it would. Because you're right, if you could just templatize the name and hard code the kind and API group, effectively you would get the same behavior. Then some other component can, instead of creating the data source object, would be responsible for creating the snapshot object or the clone object. The only benefit you get from having the level of indirection is that a secondary controller could create the volume data source object, but it would still need to be aware of the type of source.
I think, hold on, if we go back and go back one slide, and here, if stateful set templatizes the data source, it's gonna still be tied to a specific snapshot, right? It
No,
can't,
I mean,
like it will be like new snapshot 0, new
Right.
snapshot 1,
right.
but then that doesn't really support the case where you're like periodically taking snapshots, because
Sure,
each new round of snapshots is gonna needs to have some different new name to it.
But then how does that help if you go using this other method?
So if you look at DataSource, the actual snapshot name is completely unrelated, right? It can have like a specific date or time to it.
Oh, you're right.
But the point I was trying to make earlier is again with the existing model, if you're pointing that to a CRD anyway, then your external controller can do this, and you have this exact same thing that's on this slide right here. It's just instead of kind volume data source, it's kind state
Volume snapshot or something else.
Yeah, exactly. But it behaves the exact same way.
Not really, because so like when you create the snapshot object, you're creating a snapshot at a specific time, right? But then when you want to restore something, you want to go and restore from something that you already created in the past.
It is the exact same thing.
No, it's different, because if you had a controller create a volume snapshot, that means you're going to take a volume snapshot at that moment, and so that's already too late.
To be clear, I'm not proposing that you utilize the same snapshot controller that would actually specify the identical YAML that you have here.
Yeah, so the kind wouldn't be snapshot. It would still be volume data source, but the name would still be treated as a templated name. So you get this exact same thing here, except in the PVC, it doesn't just say name, it says
So
name,
I think Michelle's argument is around having a mapping. So if you go down the path that you're proposing, what you're saying is that the name of volume snapshot objects has to match what the PVC or the stateful set expects. So normally, like Michelle was saying, if you're creating a snapshot, you're creating a snapshot foo with some timestamp in the name, right?
Sorry to interrupt. I don't think that's the assumption. Like the assumption wouldn't be the template. If you go back to the old way, the templated name, the kind wouldn't be volume snapshot. It can still be volume data source when we introduce it later.
Oh, sure. That's
exactly.
fine.
And the name would still be templated. So you can still get the same behavior as you're proposing here. We just introduce it out of band or later.
Okay, so then we're on the same page. I think we're saying that we do want a data source object. I thought you were arguing for you do not want a data source object and it doesn't make sense to have a standalone data source object.
No, I think the point is we already have a data source object. It's just not called data source. It's called whatever custom CRD it is.
Right.
It's the exact same way as what you're presenting.
Right. So then would you be on board with introducing a third type, which is specifically volume data source? And then inside that volume data source, you could specify the two existing types as well as, undefined future types. Or is that something?
Pointer.
That's what I had hoped we were doing, honestly.
So can I have, this is Tim. I don't come very often, but I thought I would snoop today. I have to run to another SIG meeting in just a minute, but I wanted to just say, like, from an API review point of view, every new type has to justify itself, and I'm finding this one a little thin so far.
I have another question. So we've been talking, well, I'm here just from time to time, I'm Sergey. So we're talking about the cloning. We tried, I think, at some point to discuss replication, meta and remote replication. And I remember some discussions where we spoke about the data source and try to combine replication with the work we're doing today. I've heard today that you guys are saying that we need to look at the use cases to make a proper decision. I think it's correct. Maybe we can quickly take a look at how the storage machine and Kubernetes will do this work for the user in snapshot and clone, and maybe we can discuss a little bit replication. which I don't think we covered. Maybe I'm not up to speed.
Yeah, replication is different. That's another discussion, I think.
That's a much bigger topic.
Yeah, that one actually currently you can do. You can handle that by your driver, basically. That's what you can do currently. That's not really part of this discussion yet.
So, hi, this is Ritesh, and in the past, we tried to use CSI driver to make a workflow which is based on Argo work, where we would create thousands of volumes essentially, which are used as part of a machine learning pipeline. And the fact that we cannot runtime tell which volume we want to use was a big limitation, and ephemeral volumes seem to be the only solution. So how does this help in any way in addressing workflows where there is a lot of immutable data that's created and referenced?
I'm sorry, you're talking about just volumes, but what about data source? What you're talking about doesn't have anything to do with data source? Is the volume just like an empty volume, and then it's created as an empty volume, but not just something created from a snapshot or created from another volume?
So think about snapshots, but in the count is thousands, not like a few hundred.
Mm-hmm.
What's your question?
I'm not quite sure. I thought you were talking about the volumes, thousands of volumes.
You can create thousands of volumes from thousands of snapshots in either mechanism. Not a big deal.
Right, but I just don't quite get what is the question.
So the problem is that you were wanting to hold off the release of this, which has a hard stop at the 29th, right, Saad? That's why this conversation is coming out.
Yeah, and I think there's a compromise here where I like what John is saying, which is we can kind of have our cake and eat it too by saying, let's unblock snapshot and volume cloning, let it do what it's doing right now. If we think that having a separate data source object is useful, we could introduce it as a third type. And then, it'll be a little bit more confusing for users, but it'll give us the flexibility of velocity.
Hey, Saad, why don't we have to create another data source? Why can't we just open up the kind as John was suggesting? Right, so other than volume and PVC, we have another kind, which is a CRD or something.
Right.
So if you do that, then you can only specify your volume source inline. And so all these little subtle things that we're talking about, like the stateful set case, right? Like I understand what Michelle is getting at. If you provision a bunch of snapshots, you're going to provision them with a certain format, and you're going to have two incrementing bits inside of that name. One is going to be the identifier for that particular volume type, like 1, 2, 3, 4. It corresponds to the stateful set replica. And the second is going to be the timestamp. And now that should be your volume snapshot name. Embedding that logic into a snapshot controller to inject into a data source inline name is going to be very challenging. So for example, in this case, if you have snapshot dash timestamp -1, the problem is that now you fixed this snapshot to always use a specific timestamp.
Well,
that's actually the best argument I've heard in favor of this change.
Well, I still don't understand.
May I? Hi.
So if you,
sorry, may I inject a very simple use case that I think Michelle referred to, or we talked about it last year, is when I am trying to restore essentially a stateful set which created PVCs from a template, and I need to be able to establish this sort of one-to-many relationship to a number of volume snapshots that will provide the data for this restored stateful set for the PVCs. And without a custom type, I think this was the conclusion that we came to. I'm not sure, it's been a while. Without a custom type that allows me to add some sort of filtering or a lookup of my volume snapshots, how would I establish this one-to-many relationship? So
yeah,
I'm not sure if this is clear.
Yeah, that's exactly the use case that I was talking about here. So if you, if we have a separate standalone type, you can imagine that the snapshot controller for each one of those volumes for PVC1, PVC2, PVC3 creates a new snapshot that'll be PVC1 dash some timestamp, PVC2 dash that same timestamp or whatever, and creates a number of those.
That naming is hard coded into the controller. That's what you were saying without this custom type.
Exactly.
But
okay, I don't think that's.
But the point is you're looking. Everybody's looking at this from the context of the existing snapshot controller.
Yeah.
For example, just like you would use a GitHub controller or a GitHub kind for the GitHub workflow, which was the initial problem, for the stateful snapshot controller. And that should do things like when it creates a snapshot, it should do things like give it a timestamp that includes the stateful set ID or whatever it is to signify which one it's from.
How does this the stateful set controller cooperate with one of these external controllers?
So it would be the external controller. So you would have to use whether it's a label or whatever it might be, or you just look for snapshots and check to see if the volume is part of a stateful set inside of the monitor.
But so what do you put in your stateful set to say, hey, I want to cooperate with this external controller?
So in my view, I haven't looked at it like in an implementation perspective yet, but in my view, you wouldn't put any of that in there. What you'd look for is basically just listening for snapshot requests. And anytime it saw one, it would check to see if that volume that was being snapshotted was part of the stateful set.
Sorry, I don't follow that flow. So if I create a stateful set object that says, I want to, how do I specify what set of kind of snapshots that I want to use inside of a stateful set?
Oh, so as far as, so you're talking the restore, not the actual snapshot itself.
Yes.
So for the restore, I would put it in the spec, just like we have now, but it would point to an external. It would be this stateful set snapshot, whatever it's called, right?
Right, but so now if there's two variables here, right? One variable is the replica number, and the second one is the timestamp for that volume snapshot. So is the assumption that you're going to hard code the timestamp in here and then let the stateful set?
No, I wouldn't. So if you go back to your slide number 4, you would have this. The only difference is the kind would not be volume data source. It would be.
Yeah. Okay. So we're on the same page, John. I think I'm trying to argue with people who are saying that this standalone object is completely unnecessary.
So I think that. Yeah, I think that I'm arguing, I'm postulating that if we just remove the restrictions on the data source type, the typed local object, or whatever it's called, local object reference. If we just remove that and rely on series, we can implement exactly what you have here. It just won't have the same kind. It'll have I think is okay.
I think so. Let's walk through an example real quick. I want to kind of walk through what the implications of that are.
So snapshots are tricky, right? Because they're in two sides of the problem.
Yeah. So let's say this is what you're proposing. And let's put something like snapshot -1 and snapshot -1. So now what that means is in your data source, option 1 is you specify my PVC -1 data source. versus the alternative is that you would hard code this in line.
Yeah, I would never hard code that in line, is what I'm saying.
So let's walk through the example of, let's say we allow, any arbitrary data source. Are you suggesting that this volume data source object will still exist or won't exist?
I'm suggesting that particular one right there would not. That would be your stateful set backups or snapshots, whatever custom thing, right? So it would follow that.
You're proposing a SIG for stateful set snapshots, right?
Oh, so you're suggesting another type. So you're calling this.
Yeah.
I don't think
so what I'm suggesting you actually use that that populator example that I had.
So what would the exact kind be called here?
Whatever you want.
So his suggestion is not to add a specific type. I think he's just saying leave it generic, and then people can add whatever they need to add.
Right. Write a CRD that's kind foo.
Right. Exactly.
But Kubernetes won't understand that.
Yeah, that's the key.
Kubernetes doesn't have to understand it.
It doesn't have to.
It does.
A formalized type.
It does need to understand it because it needs to know when to hold off and when not to hold off, right?
Well, I get it. So, but that's the thing is inside of the controller that handles this, when it creates the PVC, why isn't it good enough to just have it so it creates the PVC? If we introduce the new state that says pending initialization or whatever we want to call it, it's not actually ready for use until this is actually satisfied, and then it's a declarative system again.
How do you communicate that to the CSI driver that doesn't understand that CRD type though?
The CSI driver doesn't need to know. So
it does. So we want to allow for two possible ways of using data source. One is what you're suggesting, which is there is a third-party external populator that fills data, and there's some storage controller that provisions the volume. But we also want to allow for the case where the populator and the storage system are the same and are handled by the CSI driver alone.
Right.
And that's a discussion we really need to have to add clarity to this whole.
But we already have that.
We have that for snapshot. We're not going to have that for generic controllers if we go down this path.
Well, so, but you just continue to add it based on the capabilities reported back from the plugin, right? So
no, because it's an arbitrary type, right? Like you're talking about a foo populator.
But it wouldn't be arbitrary if it's something that the plugin is actually expected to support and handle.
So either, what about for standalone kind of populators?
So for CSI, don't we have in the create volume, we have the volume content source type. I mean, can't we change that based on what we read here?
That's what we already do. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, so I mean, even if you add a new type, that field will have new types, right?
Right, but then Kubernetes needs to be updated to say, hey, for this specific type, we handle it special. It's a first class thing. It's not a generic thing.
Yeah, I'm starting to understand because with the volume data source, you can have special meaning for the snapshot, the volume snapshot kind within the data source spec, and for to do clones and snapshots. But then you could also have handling with just a plain CRD that wouldn't need to be recognized by CSI drivers.
Yeah, so in the way that works today is I can pass in, and I actually have prototypes that if it's a type that isn't reported in the capabilities of the backend device, then it's just a pass-through operation. It goes to pending, and it's up to that external controller to go ahead and complete the operation, update the status.
But the external controller, remember that these external controllers that we're talking about are like the external provisioner, for example. You can't have it operate on unknown CRDs.
No, it doesn't. That's the point.
So then let's walk through this example that you have here, which is let's introduce a new type. We're going to call it foo. And what it represents is a mapping between data source and volume snapshot, right? So what I want is I want a stateful set that is able to snap to latest snapshot. And so let's walk through what that would look like.
So this is the problem. So snapshots are the problem because we've now split it into two pieces, right? So since you would have to make that return trip back to the provisioner again, you have a problem.
Right.
But there could be other data sources that also require going back to the provisioner.
So yes. You're going to do an external operation and then an internal operation again?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what it's going to look like. I would really like to have that discussion before we have this discussion, but there's the timing question. But I'm imagining, like, what if we wanted to invent like a proprietary data source type for NetApp, for example? And like, I don't know what that would look like, but one could imagine just defining a CRD that says, populate my volume from this, where it only makes sense.
So I'll give you an example that NetApp might want to do that I did. So QoS. I did a data source for QoS because it was the only way I could figure out to pass things in. But the problem is it doesn't go somewhere externally first and then back in. That's the trick. And I don't know how to solve that, but I don't know how to solve it with the other.
Well, one could imagine with this new data source scheme, NetApp could just define its own CRD, and then the user could specify it, and then somehow it works its way into the CSI driver. And
the trick is the somehow part.
Right. That's the giant question mark. But if we figure that out, then you could make this happen. But it has to be something that happens at create volume time. We can't create an empty volume and then.
Yeah, the reason that this is possible if we have a standalone data source is because the existing controllers that we have know that if some data source is specified, I don't know what it is, versus the data source not being specified at all are two different things. So if I specify a data source and that doesn't exist, then it's going to hold off on provisioning altogether. And you have the ability to basically interject at that point and do something.
But you also take away your ability to ever have any custom data source types.
No, you're not. Because this volume data source here could be, an arbitrary CRD here.
So let's say it is that case. How are you going to pass that info to the driver then also?
I think that's a separate discussion that we aren't having that I'd like to have. But I wanted, for this discussion, I wanted to get back to the question of timing, because I really don't like the answer of let's have our cake and eat it too, because that's going to result in a gross API. I think we can all agree that this separate volume data source object, whether it's necessary or not, it certainly doesn't make anything worse. So it's a question of, is it better enough to justify the time delay that it's going to cause? And I wanted to ask the very pointed question of exactly how much delay will adding a new API type cause? Is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? Is it 9 months? That was not clear.
You're also assuming we're going to be able to add another API type.
Yeah.
That's an assumption.
Minimum, I think it would be 2 quarters, possibly 3, which is 6 to 9 months.
So, and what exactly would happen then in 1.16 and 1.17 and 1.18?
So I think 1.16, we figure out what this volume data source thing would look like. 1.17, introduce it as alpha. 1.18, promote it to beta, and then that unblocks snapshot. If we do it in that order and say that snapshot and cloning are dependent on this, which I'm actually leaning against now.
Well, I don't know. I think given disagreements and people being confused, I think waiting is the better idea, even though it's going to be painful. I don't like the idea of having the 2 ways to do the same thing.
Yeah, I don't think you would have to have 2 ways to do the same thing. But
if we end up doing this volume data source separate object that can also point back to the snapshot, you'd have 2 different ways to restore.
Yeah, I don't think you need to do that, but. And if nothing else, then call it something different, right? Because the only problem that it's really geared towards fixing is the split brain problem of the snapshots, at least right now. So if it comes down to it and we decide we have to do something, you could always call it, and you want to introduce a new kind, a new solid API object, then give it a different name.
I think naming is fine, but I like walking through the concrete use cases. I think there is a gap here, especially with stateful set that is not handled with the existing proposal. And like this proposal to have like an arbitrary like food type that'll handle this, I don't know. I'm not convinced that would work.
My only reservation, and you're probably gonna roll eyes here, but is that having it be in the persistent volume claim when we want to do something besides volumes makes it restrictive. But I don't think that that's based on anything that we're currently doing or going to do. So is it fair to say we could hash out the use cases, look at the pros and cons, and then push this out maybe just a quarter to make those decisions instead of committing to this and pushing snapshots and cloning out 3 quarters? I mean, what's the...
Yeah, ideally, I do not want to block cloning and snapshot. I think there's been a lot of work done there, and for it to then last minute get blocked on this for a couple quarters is not going to reflect well on our community.
Can volume data source or data source reference or whatever we end up calling it just be implemented as a CRD, and then we can just do it later? I just don't understand why you could, because perhaps if you have that, then if the reference is of a known type, then that Kubernetes could still pass that reference onto the CSI drivers through the reference, if you will, or through the indirection. So if we have a clear path of doing this as a CRD, let's just keep that as an option for the future and unblock the inline use cases.
Yeah, I think that's the pragmatic approach. I agree with Ben that it's going to confuse users because you'll have 2 different ways of doing the same thing, but it will probably be, let's just keep moving. Let's keep the velocity going.
Well, and let's have that other discussion sooner rather than later, which is that how the heck are we going to take these future data source types and plumb them through the sidecar into the CSI driver? Because I think if we all understood what that looked like, we would be a lot less nervous about this.
Yeah, and then we need to also make sure that stateful sets is part of that picture, whatever we come up with. So I guess it sounds like action items are, we're going to continue the deep dive into this area to see if it makes sense to have a standalone volume data source that would be introduced as a separate CRD. In the meantime, we are going to unblock snapshot and unblock volume cloning to continue to beta this quarter if they can make it, or next quarter. And then before we introduce data populators, which is currently in design, we need to finish the discussion on this generic volume data source and make sure it aligns with that proposal as well as what we want to do with stateful sets. Does anybody object to that?
It's a good idea. I would like to ask again, do you guys know where replication is being discussed? Because to me, replication, cloning, and snapping are 3 types of protecting the volume.
Yeah, that's a good question, Sergey. We're handling it currently separately. Michelle and I have been bouncing ideas off each other about how to handle replication as well as volume consistency groups and other things. Mm-hmm. And we have kind of a straw man between us around a new volume group object, which you could think of as similar to kind of a storage class in PV in some ways. Basically, a object that says, for this group of volumes, I have some arbitrary, storage system defined properties on it. One of those properties could be replication. Another property could be spreading across some storage topology. Another property could be consistency groups. I don't think that discussion needs to overlap with this one. I think it's fairly standalone. But yes, we can have that discussion as well.
It will be great. I just want to say something opposite to what you said. If I think like a user, well, I'm trying to discuss a use case. I am typically, not today maybe, but yesterday, I'm thinking about the volumes which exist locally in snapshot, and clone is a local replication. That's how it's called. And if volume is being replicated remotely, 1 site, 3 sites, or many sites, I'm thinking also about the volume which lives in the storage machine. And we constantly talk about volumes. So I would love to discuss it, because to me, in Kubernetes, it looks like the logical thing about that volume is basically PVC and PV at the bottom. So maybe we can have little use case discussion to clear this up. And to me, I have to come up to speed on the data source, but maybe data source is also one of the ways we can do it generically.
Yeah, I think what this points to is it's time for us to have a nice two-day face-to-face meeting. It's been a while since the SIG has had one, and we have, I think, enough big, large designs that it might be worthwhile.
I agree with that.
So if anybody wants to help us host one and has some available space, we can help with CNCF funding. If not, I'll think through, see if I can find some space for it. And we should definitely do something.
I think we also should prepare with a good pictorial use cases of everything. So when we go into the design, it's just a suggestion, guys, I'm sorry. But I joined because I thought I may add something to all this. I think when we look at what needs to be done for the three major use cases, snapshot and clone and restoring and active replication, and how all this stuff supposed to, what customer is looking for, then we will have excellent input. I actually like this proposal today, the new proposal of decomposing and having some other object. I think it's great. But I don't want to say yet before we understand how customer will use it, how simply allow him to do things in Kubernetes the way Kubernetes nicely does everything else.
Yeah, we have to be grounded in concrete reality instead of hypotheticals. I agree.
It's a requirement of what needs to be done, which in my opinion drives the design.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, so any objections to the plan as proposed, which is unblock clone and volume snapshots, and continue to think about volume data source as a standalone object?
I'll just register my objection to having two different ways to do things.
Yep, that is absolutely heard. I agree with it. But I think we got to be a little bit pragmatic here as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. As someone trying to get a proposal for CSI support into our program and kind of match the CSI level of support, this will be disruptive if we end up with two different ways of doing things. So we may end up pausing our CSI work if it's going to end up stretching into 6 to 9 quarters of what the actual solution will be.
That is interesting feedback, Nolan. So what is the driver behind that if that happens? Is it that you are invested in snapshots and you want to have a consistent way to do snapshots, or you're interested in generic data populators, or what are you interested in that this could
so right now that it's mostly in snapshots. We may have uses for populators. So I'm working on a proposal for snapshot support in Valero to replace our current direct to provider snapshot API. Like, we want to get rid of Valero's plugins and just support CSI eventually.
Got it.
But we've been kind of non-committal on it because we don't know where it's going, and this seems like it would delay that further. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to pursue our CSI design if we're going to have two different ways of doing snapshots that we have to support just within CSI.
And I mean, would you be able to design in such a way that you could basically commit to one approach and say, this is the way that, you know, our product builds on top of this?
Potentially. Like right now, the design for Valero is mostly implementing the import case on, there's a blog post describing how to import an existing snapshot. So it may just be an internal detail where we have to create a volume data source in addition to the other CRDs. But we do edit the PVC, like on restore, we go and map everything so that it's getting recreated from the volume snapshot.
And so from that perspective, you would prefer to have the standalone data source, and if that option is available, you'd like to wait for that discussion to resolve before you move forward?
Yeah, like I right now we edit the PVC directly and specify the data source field. If a snapshot was taken of an existing PVC and it didn't have a data source, when we restore into a new cluster, we may still have to add it to get the mapping to the snapshot.
Got it.
What do you mean? You basically, when you restore it, you import the snapshot, right? And then then you create a PVC from it, right?
Right, but the way Valero works, the way Valero works is it's recreating the PVC with the same name, but it may edit it to actually map it to the volume snapshot in a different cluster. So it's importing all the YAML definition into a new cluster.
Okay, so that's good feedback. I think take that into account. I think what this means is that we have to have a very high bar for introducing volume data source. I think if we were very early in the design, this would have been less contentious, but rightfully so. Like, we're so far along, there's a lot of momentum, and anything new that we introduce needs to have a very high bar for the value add that it has, which is basically what I'm hearing here. So I think the current plan makes sense. Let's not block volume snapshot or cloning. Let's consider volume data source as a standalone thing that could potentially also introduce new ways to do volume snapshot and cloning. But we need to talk through the use cases end to end and understand the value add very clearly, so that one, we don't introduce extra confusion into the community, and two, we have the justification for introducing a new API object. So does that sound okay to everyone?
Well, and by the way, once we understand how we would do other future CRD data sources and exactly how they would work, it'll be a lot easier to think through the implications of this pointer style volume data source and exactly how it would be implemented and whether it would be ugly or not. That's my opinion. Because that's the thing that I keep getting stuck on, is I don't know how I'm going to implement future volume data sources. I just don't get it.
Right. And that's right. So basically what we're saying is that the future data populator discussion is very closely intertwined with this, and we need to kind of have those hand in hand.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And Nolan, to your comment on the chat, yes, that'd be great. We can sync up offline if you'd like.
Awesome. Yeah, we can. I realize we probably should have been involved in SIG storage earlier, but we're trying to jump in more now.
Cool. All right, we are at the end of the hour. Any other comments, concerns, objections, anything? All right, thank you very much. I love having these discussions. I feel like we're back in the old days. So thank you for entertaining me, and take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.